When you think of video games today, you think of many different genres, spanning from battle royales to RPGs to platformers too. The sky is the limit for what video games can really be. So you may ask, when did video games as a concept began? Well, the year was 1958. The mere concept of video games was first visualized with Tennis for Two being released in 1958. While a simple game in today's standards, it was a grand revolution for what video games can and truly be. This could be seen with its behemoth of a controller, with a knob and a button, one of which would become the standard later, which would be the big rectangle of a controller. This game actually inspired many people, I mean a few from MIT, to actually create their own game called Space War that will be released in 1962. You can already see the difference between Tennis for Two and Space War in terms of graphics, but you can also see some more physics in the game. For example, the gravity present in Space War was something revolutionary. You didn't have that in Tennis for Two. The mere concept of a space game was actually very innovative for the time, and now it brought on for the next decade some new space-related titles we will see later on. However, there was a small issue with these two games. Not the fact that they were simplistic, but because they were on this machine. Yeah, I don't think this is fitting in anyone's house. So, there had to be a change to that. The way we would play video games forever would change in 1972, when the console called the Magnavox Odyssey would release. Selling over 350,000 units, it was the first breakout in the video game industry. With its brick of a controller, new games presented itself in the form of the Odyssey. Now you can play many games like Simon Says and baseball. Truly gaming, right? While the Magnavox Odyssey was the first home video game console released, video games were actually starting to become a popular form a year before, in 1971. This would be through the arcade cabinet, and the game in question would be called Computer Space. By inserting a coin into this cabinet, you will be able to play this game, making it one of the first video games to be available to the wider public. While these games were being released at the time, a new console was emerging from the depths: Atari. The same year as the Magnavox Odyssey, Atari released a arcade cabinet, which the game included was called Pong, which will forever change and broaden the scope of video games to the wider public. Its simple yet addictive gameplay brought Atari to the forefront of gaming in the 1970s. Despite the success of the Pong arcade cabinet, it was not the most successful console of its generation. That title will go to the Coleco Telstar. This console was the first to ever sell more than 1 million units, which was a record at the time. The Telstar released 13 iterations of their console over its lifetime. So, if the Telstar is too modern for you, get the Telstar Classic. If you want to feel like a cowboy, get the Telstar Ranger. If you want to say f*** you to the other 11 zodiac signs, get the Telstar Gemini. However, in the same year as the Telstar, a new console would appear, the Fairchild Channel F. This gaming console brought forth a new innovative feature up to this point in gaming: the removable cartridge slot. No longer did you have to buy 6 different consoles to play just 6 different games. You can play on one console many different games at once. So now you can play Hangman and Checkers on the same console with 2 different cartridges. While the first generation of consoles were very influential to gaming, it's really in the second generation where gaming took its stride, starting with the Atari 2600. Being released in 1977, the Atari 2600 wood grain finish and its rod-like controller called the joystick was a revolution to gaming. During this time, the arcades were the innovators of the video game industry, but the Atari 2600 was the first to jump the gap between arcade and video game console ports. One of the most iconic games to jump to the 2600 was Space Invaders. This game sold over 6 million units on the 2600, a record-breaking amount for a video game at the time. With further releases of games like Pac-Man, Pitfall, and Donkey Kong later coming out to the console, each selling millions of copies, it just proved that video games were becoming something more than just a fad. However, despite the commercial success brought forth by these arcade to console ports, many games on the Atari 2600 were critically panned, with little quality control brought forth by many of these games. Take the aforementioned Pac-Man for example. Comparing this game to its arcade counterpart, the difference is clear. It was a fact that most games brought to the 2600 were inherently worse than their arcade counterparts, but some were able to retain their quality more than others. This was a growing trend in the early 1980s where the lack of quality control in video games was not present at all. Many games releasing to the Atari 2600 and other consoles at the time were just something, alright? However, the most infamous of these games was called E.T. This game was so poorly received that the publisher had to bury 12 million copies of the game in the desert of New Mexico. In the span of just 6 weeks, this game had to be conceptualized and produced in order to meet the deadline for the holiday season. If that doesn't show the rush and poor quality control of video games at the time, I don't know what does. Despite the overwhelming success of the 2600, there were other second generation consoles released as well. One of them was the Intellivision, released by Mattel. Being released in 1979, the Intellivision was graphically superior to the Atari 2600. Mattel tried to cater this console to adults by releasing many sports games onto this console. For example, games like NFL football were released onto this console, making it more appealing to adults compared to the Atari 2600. However, sports games were not the main focus of the Intellivision, as other popular games were released onto it as well. One of the most popular games on the Intellivision was called Astro Smash, selling over 1 million units. And in total, 132 titles were sold on the Intellivision. Mattel was also focused on hardware revisions on the Intellivision, with their redesign, the Intellivision 2. It was a small form factor and cheaper to produce, which will respond to the growing competition in the console industry at the time. Only selling 3 million units, however, the Intellivision did not make a dent onto Atari's stranglehold in the video game industry. Another competitor in the second generation of consoles was the ColecoVision. This console being released in 1982 was late into the generation, with its main selling point being that it brought arcade quality games to the home. Being the successor of the Telstar, its main game was an officially licensed port of Nintendo's Donkey Kong, which proved to be a success as 1 million copies were sold on the console. Comparing this version of Donkey Kong to the Atari version, it shows the advancements that video games have gone through in the span of a few short years, and also shows the graphically superior quality on the ColecoVision. I mean, just look at the two. Which one would you be playing? But entering into 1983, the fate of video games would change forever in a single event, the video game crash of 1983. This crash was the result of years of third-party developers releasing mediocre games to many of the consoles mentioned. I mean, what were they thinking publishing this? Another cause of this crash was the oversaturation of video game consoles itself. With the amount of consoles at the time, a consumer would be frustrated with the amount of games they have to buy for each console if they were buying more than one console. Just look at this list, there's too many consoles that this is just an eyesore. The final blow came with the rise of the personal computer as well. They were much more powerful and versatile than video game console itself, which led to many consumers just ignoring video game consoles entirely. By the end of 1985, the video game market went from its then peak of 3.2 billion in 1983 to just 100 million in 1985. If there were only a console that could save the video game market. Oh wait!